Yousef, and this is going to be my presentation for the PDRP program during fall 2021. For this semester I was mentioned by Ezra, and overall it's been a lot of fun. I guess today my presentation is going to be about QCD, quantum chromodynamics, and its relation to the process of hadronization. So yeah, let's get started. When talking about QCD, the first question that we can ask is, what is the smallest thing in our universe? These smallest things are called elementary particles, and they are described by the standard model that is present here on the right side. When we're talking about QCD, we're going to be talking about quarks and the gluon. We can also define a hadron. What exactly is a hadron? A hadron, by definition, is they're particles that are composed of partons, and partons is simply another name for either quarks or gluons. These quarks and gluons they are part of our hadron. So on our left here we can see an example of a hadron, and this specifically is a proton, and we can see it has two up quarks and one down quark, and we can also see that has some gluons are being exchanged between amongst them. So all of these individually are partons, and they come together to form our hadron, which we know as the example of the hadron, which we know as the proton. Let's define QCD. So QCD stands for quantum chromodynamics, and it's the study of the strong interaction between quarks and gluons. So there's four fundamental forces. There's the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and the gravitational force. QCD is specifically the study of that strong force, that strong interaction. Gluons are the mediators of this strong interaction, just like photons are for the electromagnetic force. So one thing to know about QCD is that it's hard to study QCD. It's really hard to study, and the reason for that is that a big part of QCD, these quarks, are never observed by themselves independently in nature. To see why this is, we can look at this left diagram here. So we start with some meson, and this is another name for a quark anti-quark pair, and we try pulling it apart so we can observe these quark and anti-quark independently. So we put some energy and we pull it, put some more energy, we pull it further apart, and we put some more energy, and so on and so on. Right before we can actually pull it apart, the energy becomes so great that it forms another whole quark anti-quark pair. So in the end, after trying to pull them apart, we're simply left with two quark anti-quark pairs, and we didn't get anywhere with trying to observe a quark independently. So it's impossible to do. Before we go any further, we can also define some definitions. So firstly, what is Q squared? Q squared is we're going to use it to abbreviate the form momentum transferred between interacting particles, and we're going to square that. So on the right here, we can see an example of the form momentum. So it has the energy as well as the three constituent momentums, and these are the quantities transferred between interacting particles, and we simply take this this form momentum and square it. We can also talk about the coupling constant. The coupling constant is simply a measure of the strength of a force exerted in interaction. And one thing that we need to know is that there's a number of coupling constants. When we're talking about the coupling constant for the strong interaction, the one that we're studying in QCD, we should know that its orders of magnitude larger than those of the electromagnetic force or the gravitational force. And this is really important, and we're going to see why when we talk about perturbative versus non-perturbative techniques. These perturbative and non-perturbative techniques are simply ways that we can techniques that we can apply to solve a physics problem. So when we apply a perturbative technique to solve a physics problem, we start with the approximation, and we attempt to build upon it. So, for example, we might start out with if we want to measure like how particles and their output particles interact in their final product. We might start with a first layer where we have just one part, one or two particles, and they're not interacting. Then we add another layer, where a couple of them interact and they produce output particles, and then we can add yet another layer where those output particles interact with the original particles, and we can keep on adding these layers until we arrive at our final answer. But this doesn't always work. And the reason for that is that in QCD, when we apply our perturbative techniques, we have an expansion, over some terms, and these so it's expansion that involves the coupling constant that we mentioned earlier. But what happens is that if this coupling constant is greater than one, if it's large, then what happens is that this expansion is not going to converge to not and won't give us our final answer. And as we continue, the coupling constant continues to grow. So like our answer that we arrive on just becomes more and more less and less accurate. So when this happens, we have to turn to non-perturbative techniques, and these are simply, what happens here is that we simply compute the answer to our problem using computational methods. So yeah, let's move forward. So yeah, we'll now introduce factorization, which is the idea that let's say we have some physics process that is the combination of a bunch of sub processes. Factorization is the idea that we can learn about each of these sub processes independently, take the results and combine them to give us our final to give us some result for that that overall process. So yeah, for example, in this following diagram, we have this on the top right, this diagram. We can describe using this process theorem. So we start with some part-time distribution function. We're going to talk about each of these in the next slides. But yeah, so we have like some part-time distribution function, some hard scattering process, some part-time chart, like a hadronization, and we analyze each of these independently, find out some some stuff about them, and then combine our observations, and then to give us give us our answer, I guess, for what we want to say. So yeah, now let's take a look at each of these four subprocesses independently. So yeah, the first is part-time distribution functions, and what these are, they simply describe the probability of having a parton of type I in a nucleus of type N that carries a fraction x of the longitudinal momentum of the hands. So yeah, but they are basically, to boil it down, they're just simply momentum distributions of partons within some hadron. So yeah, one thing that we need to know is that in this right diagram on the right here, where we have, this is a proton, as I mentioned, where we have like three valence quarks, and some gluons being exchanged between them. This doesn't tell the full story, and the reason for that is that we have to account for seed particles. And what these particles are, so for example, to give an example, let's say we have a gluon go from the blue up quark to the red up quark. So let's say, like, while it's in the process of going forward, the gluon splits into some a quark anti-quark pair, and before it reaches the red up quark, it recombines, it annihilates. But when that quark anti-quark pair is existing, it occupies some of the momentum of the hadron. So we need to account for that in our PDFs, our part of the distribution functions. And as Q squared increases, the effects of these seed particles continues to grow as well. So yeah, and it makes it like much more complicated to deal with these PDFs, and we find them experimentally. So here on the left is this diagram. We have two diagrams. I believe these are the PDFs of a proton. These are measured experimentally. And so on the left diagram, we're at a Q squared of we have a different Q squareds, and yeah. So and we can take a look at it. But yeah. And so yeah, the next process that we're going to talk about is hard scattering. And hard scattering processes these are processes that generate hard probes of particles. And what hard probes of particles are, they're simply a probe is just an output particle or particles, and these output particle or particles are characterized by either like large Q squared or a large transverse momentum. So here on the bottom in the diagram, we have an example of hard scattering process. We have some proton and an antiproton. They come together, they collide, and we have some outgoing partons. These red arrows. And yeah, these since this is a hard scattering process, these outgoing partons, they either a large Q squared or a large transverse momentum. So yeah. So the next thing on our list was parton showers. So parton showers. So we had this hard scattering process, and we had some results at partons. from this process. But what happens, or what can happen, is that the partons can continue to split and produce more partons, and those split partons split even more, and split and split and split. So we just have a ton of them, and we have essentially a shower of partons. So yeah, that would be like in blue. So like our red, in this diagram on the right here, the red would be the hard scaling process, and the blue would be the parton showers, where we just have a ton of partons, shower of partons. So yeah, one thing to know about so if we want to calculate things about these parton showers, maybe like our final results, it's hard to do. And the reason for that is that the final diagram that describes this process is it's really large. It's hard to calculate. So yeah, while we can describe using conservative QCD, it's almost impossible to do. So we use computational methods to do it. So we use like event generators, and what these do is they simulate these particle generating events for us. So the examples like Pythia or Herwig and so on. So yeah, that finally brings us to hadronization. So hadronization is, so we had a bunch of these partons from our parton shower, and what happens is that these partons essentially combine together to form hadrons. And that's hadronization, where it's just simply the formation of hadrons out of our partons, out of these quarks and gluons. So yeah, in this diagram here, we have some parton shower. Just by a bar, it's abstracted away from us, and out of it, we have these hadrons that we observe in our detectors, since we can't observe hadrons. So yeah, one thing to know about hadronization, it's not a very well understood process. And the reason for that is, we start with some initial momentum in a hard scaling process, but that momentum became, I guess you could say, distributed amongst all of these many partons. So when we're performing calculations about hadronization, we're at really low q squared. But it just so happens that at these really low q squared, the coupling constant, this alpha s, becomes increasingly high as well. And that what we discussed in the previous slide, that means that we cannot describe using perturbation theory. So you have to turn to non-perturbative techniques, these models and computational methods. So one such model is the Lorentz string model. And this is the idea that there's some string connecting two quarks, and as the distance between these two quarks grows, eventually the string just snaps, and when it snaps, it breaks into a bunch of hadrons. So yeah, this is just more of a way of thinking about hadronization. And yeah, it's this idea, I guess, is used in packages like Pythia, and so on. So yeah, we can talk about some of the applications of hadronization, some places where it occurs. And one case is the jet process, jet producing events. So yeah, what are jets? Jets are narrow cones of hadrons and other particles that originate from certain high energy collisions. So in this diagram here that my cursor is pointing over, you can see that we had some interaction and it produced some quark. And this quark, it results in a parton shower. These, we can see the splitting here, and which eventually, the partons from these parton showers eventually formed hadrons. But what you might notice is that this process, it's not really spread around like in like a circular manner or so on. It's like concentrated more in a specific direction in this, I guess, cone right here that we can observe. So this cone is a jet. So we have like a cone of hadrons. That's what we detect in our detectors when performing these experiments. So on the right here, we can see an example. This is the 3J event we're going to talk about. And so yeah, we can see like three cones for the most part. And yeah, that's what they detect in the detectors. So yeah, this jet process starts out with some hard scattering, which eventually leads to a parton shower, if possible, which eventually leads to hadronization, and which produces the hadrons that we observe in our detectors. To like go further and more about jets. So the true events that such as in this diagram here that my cursor is over are the most likely to occur, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. But a 3J event can also it's been observed, it's possible. So in this case, here we have 1, 2, 3 cones, and that's why we call it a 3J event. So we have 3 jets. And an interesting fact about these 3J events is that they prove the existence of the gluon. And the reason for this is that if you look at this diagram on the right here, is that the extra jet is it's caused by this gluon here on that my cursor's over, and that gluon is caused from it being emitted by that quark, and that's why we observe that third jet. It's originating from this gluon. So yeah, that's why it proves the existence of the gluon. And the reason that 3G events are less likely, and why 4G events are even more likely, and so on, is that we had to add these extra vertices, these, I guess you could call them intersections, and it just so happens that as we continue to add more vertices, our that specific process, that interaction becomes less likely. So yeah, that's why. Yeah. So okay, so so we know how we have, I guess, idea of how this jet process works. So we perform an experiment and we collect a bunch of data. How do we identify where exactly these jets are so we can learn more about them? So to do that, we have to find the jets. And there's a number of algorithms that can do this. So our problem it boils down to finding these like regions with a lot of high momentum particles. These like cones with tons of high momentum particles, which for the most part are hadrons. So yeah, one way to do this, one idea, I guess, is our cone algorithms, and the basic idea, what they boil down to is, we find the most energetic particle that a detector detects, and draw some cone around it, and we label that cone a jet, and we remove it, we add it to like our bag of jets, and we perform the process once again. And obviously, we have to have like some threshold for what we consider to be an energetic particle, so that we stop after some time. And but yeah, so happens that most of the good cone algorithms are either slow, inefficient, hard to calculate, or so on. So they're not used very often today, and there's much more modern techniques that make use of other algorithms. And I read something about like artificial intelligence also being applied to it. So there's much more modern techniques for doing this. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you for watching, I guess. I had a lot of fun, learning about this material and writing this presentation. And I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I did creating. So yeah, thanks.